In the fall of 2019 and winter of 2020, Competitive Wisconsin engaged in a series of executive briefing sessions around the state. Those sessions focused on research conducted by CWI and Deloitte on workforce shortages, competition for workers, and possible revenue streams. They also focused on the conclusions and recommendations that came out of collaborative discussions and meetings held around the state on these issues in 2018 and 2019. Competitive Wisconsin believes that a workforce recruitment and retention strategy can only succeed if it is competitive, effective, and sustainable. Based on our work with Deloitte, we believe we have identified a range of recruitment and retention incentives that, funded sufficiently, would enable Wisconsin to compete effectively. We also believe, however, that the funding for such incentives must be appropriate and sustainable. With that in mind, CWI worked with Deloitte to test three assumptions, including 1, when jobs are not filled, public and private revenues are lost. 2, it is possible to quantify the value of revenues lost when jobs are not filled. And 3, if the first two assertions are valid, it is possible to design recruitment incentives that would be financed with a relatively small portion of the public and private revenues generated when a job is filled. And if all of these assertions are valid, it is then possible to generate the revenues Wisconsin needs to fund a competitive workforce recruitment and retention effort and create new public and private revenues without raising existing taxes or imposing new taxes. Competitive Wisconsin and Deloitte tested the assertions that public and private revenues were lost when jobs went unfilled, and that it was possible to quantify those losses by examining three specific job categories consistently identified in our earlier work and that appeared on the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development's Top 50 Hot Jobs, a list that includes those jobs with the largest number of openings and with per capita income higher than the state's average per capita income. More specifically, CWI targeted registered nurses, welders, and software developers, all of which are in the top 15 of the top 50 list. Then Deloitte researched each of these fields of employment and interviewed employers, and based on that information, developed specific profiles for each job classifications. These profiles were then analyzed using an in-plan model to identify and quantify the direct, indirect, and induced fiscal value of the jobs at different points in employment history. Here you can see the state and county tax values for the associate degree nurse, and for the welder, and for the software developer. CWI then asked Deloitte to determine the private sector value of each of the jobs. Here again, using an in-plan model, the assessment focused on additional annual profitability and annual turnover cost savings, for which Deloitte then developed a low case to high case set of values. With this data in hand, CWI decided that only direct public revenues and additional corporate income should be considered to determine the sufficiency and sustainability for recruitment and retention incentive funding. We also decided to use the entry-level values for evaluation purposes. So in the case of the nurse, the total public and private revenues at risk if the job is not filled is $23,974 a year. It would be $18,563 for the welder and $23,580 for the software developer. Based on ours and Deloitte's work on the marketplace for workers and the value of the effective incentive packages being offered, CWI decided to test a recruitment retention incentive investment of $20,000 per hire over a 5-year period of time. First, let's look at the value of a single person filling these jobs for 1 year. Now let's look at the value generated over a 5-year period of time. And keep in mind that these numbers do not assume raises or cost of living increases. Now let's factor in the cost of the $20,000 incentive investment. And please note here that CWI is proposing that the cost of that investment be equally shared between the public and the private sectors. The final step in determining the net return on investment, including all public and private revenues generated, lay in multiplying the number of existing job openings in each job category times the individual public and private revenues generated minus the cost of the investment. The Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development considers three types of job activity when they're developing their hot jobs numbers, including new growth, exits from the field, and transfers, that is, people inside the state moving from one job to the other. CWI decided not to include the transfer numbers, so the numbers you are looking at here represent only new growth and exits, all of which suggests that if you calculate all revenue values, you have a net ROI, or return on investment, of nearly $600 million. And if you just consider the direct public revenues and additional annual private profitability, the net is still very substantial at $287 million, which suggests to us that it is possible to fund a competitive, effective, and sustainable recruitment and retention strategy, and to do so without raising existing taxes or imposing new taxes.